Hot off the release of Jordan Peele's Nope, film Twitter was abuzz when a well-meaning so-and-so tweeted out their opinion that Jordan Peele must surely be one of the greatest film directors of all time. Peele himself responded by saying, "Sir, please put the phone down, I beg you." But now the question becomes, according to Jordan Peele, what are the best horror films of all time? Well, thankfully, IndieWire put together a list of Mr. Peele's favorite freaky flicks, and now I'm going to rank them all from S tier all the way down to F tier. But before I do, I think it would be super cool if you would subscribe to Cinemateq. I bet Jordan Peele would. Be like Jordan Peele. Let's kick things off with Jaws, a summer classic that defined blockbuster cinema when it was released in 1975. Jaws tells the story of a small town besieged by a deadly shark and even deadlier politicians that ends in a truly explosive finale.
Fire, you son of a...
It's easy to see why Peele would be so fond of Spielberg and Jaws in particular. Spielberg was, for a time, the best director when it came to mixing horror with wonder and spectacle in a way that brought people out to the box office in droves. And that, I would argue, was one of Peele's chief considerations when it came to making Nope. It's Spielbergian in a way that J.J. Abrams could only ever dream of. As for Jaws itself, if you were to set aside the legacy of the film, you would still find a tightly crafted and horrific film that still thrills with the best of them. I don't believe it reaches the artistic heights as some of the other films on this list, but I have absolutely no problem slotting Jaws squarely into the A tier. Next up is Chud.
What does it stand for?
Cannibalistic humanoid underground dweller.
Chud follows main protagonist George Cooper and the Reverend as they try to solve the mysterious disappearances of the unhoused in mid-1980s New York slums. What follows is a branching narrative that sees the two protagonists butt heads with corrupt cops, corrupt government officials, and really just a whole bunch of corrupt people. The politics of this film are anything but subtle. I don't think Chud is an especially good film, but it is fun to watch, and I must give credit where credit is due. I appreciate how director Douglas Cheek took lessons from Ridley Scott's Alien, which we will be talking about in a few minutes, by keeping the creatures shrouded in darkness, essentially hiding them from the camera and the audience as much as possible. I imagine this was done for atmospheric reasons as much as it was done for production-related reasons, and for that, I appreciate it. Overall, I would recommend Chud to all of the horror and sci-fi creature feature fans who have yet to see it, but in the grand scheme of things, I think this is actually quite a good example of a C-tier film. You gotta respect the effort. Next up is Wes Craven's all-time classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and the very first appearance of all-time iconic horror villain Freddy Krueger. The Elm Street franchise is known for its inventive kills and the charismatic performances of franchise lead Robert Englund, and that formula was set down by horror master Wes Craven in this first film of the franchise. Even after watching many horror films since first feasting my eyes on Freddy's depravity, I have yet to find a death scene that absolutely floored me like watching a young Johnny Depp get sucked into and then spat out of a bed. Additionally, I think this film stands out because Freddy is not really the only villain here. You can easily point to absent parents who take pills and drink too much as being equally responsible for the carnage that ensues. The terror of A Nightmare on Elm Street comes from social anxieties about youth growing up in a world where families are increasingly disconnected and broken, and how that trauma will affect those teenagers in the long run. And like any great horror film, it's an iconic feat that has rarely been bested and never duplicated. I don't think it quite reaches S-tier status, but I have no problem slotting it in with Jaws in the A tier. Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer is the most recent film to make it onto Jordan Peele's list, but it's an outlier in another key way. This movie will mess up your head. Visually, Under the Skin is divided into two distinct forms, showing Scarlett Johansson stalk the streets of Glasgow, and the sections where she has lured her prey back to her black goo room? Spaceship? I don't know. And that's one of the wonderful aspects of Under the Skin, especially when comparing it to other films on this list. It's more concerned with the visual depiction of themes than telling what some might call a satisfying or complete narrative. The film explores themes such as identity, empathy, and the human capacity to feel empathy, while wrapping the not-so-straightforward narrative in gorgeous visuals that do as much to aesthetically please as they do confound. I think the one thing holding Under the Skin back from the S tier is legacy. Many films on this list that reach the S tier are some of the best and most influential films ever made, and while Under the Skin certainly makes a case, I don't think we've moved far enough past its initial release to judge it on its influence. For that reason, I'm going to say that it is an A-tier film and well worth a watch. Critters is the next film to be ranked, and before the release of Jordan Peele's list, I hadn't really watched this film before. I had heard of it, but never watched it. It is a horror sci-fi comedy that focuses on a family in small-town USA desperately trying to survive attacks from tiny, and not so tiny, alien critters who have one hell of an appetite. On their side are shape-shifting alien bounty hunters and the overwhelming love the family feels for each other. And shotguns. Out of all the films on this list, I laughed with Critters the most. Not at, but with. The comedy was suitably juvenile and matched the tone of the rest of the film quite well, and I'm now really interested in seeing the other films in the Critters franchise. Please let me know in the comments if they're any good. And like how Chud learned lessons from Alien's presentation of the antagonist, I think Critters learned lessons in how to engage in meta-narrative from a film like Return of the Killer Tomatoes.
I'm thirsty. I go out and I get myself a Pepsi-Cola.
Wow, a Pepsi Cola.
Although with a bit of a twist on how to approach those references. If you know, you know. I had a lot of fun with this tight 90s slice of 80s joy, and so I'm going to put it right in the B tier. In the world of modern science fiction films, there are several examples of both incredible and influential films. 2001: A Space Odyssey, Blade Runner, and Star Wars are just a few examples. But none of them contain the horror of Ridley Scott's Alien, another one of Jordan Peele's favorite horror films. From the creature design to the ship design to being Sigourney Weaver's breakthrough role, you can point to a number of firsts that Alien gave us, and each one of those firsts was executed brilliantly. The thing that I always come back to with Alien is the technical execution of the cinematography. Please rewatch a restoration of this film and pay attention to the camera focus. It's absolutely crystal clear in a way that defies logic, and I personally have never seen anything that tops it in this specific way. I could say more about this all-time classic film, but I think we know where I'm going with this. Alien is an S-tier film. Up next is the only film on this list that will require you to read some subtitles, and that is Thomas Alfredson's Let the Right One In. The film chiefly focuses on two characters, a 12-year-old boy and a not-so-12-year-old girl who is also a vampire. This is another film that I had not watched until reading through Jordan Peele's list, and I'm happy that I eventually did. There's a lot of great stuff here, from the mood to the cinematography. You can actually feel the kind of depressing but also beautiful nature of Sweden in the winter. The snow is almost oppressive, and the fact that you never ever really see human beings outside is indicative of a lot of the horror that goes on in this film. It is the fear of being alone and being caught. It also has to be said that this film has an absolute banger of an ending. The film was pretty good up until the very end, and then when that ending came along, I was like, oh my god, is that one of the best endings to a film I've ever seen? The answer is no, but it really stuck out in my head. Unfortunately, there are aspects of the film that don't really hold up. The one example I'm going to point to are those absolutely horrendous CGI cats that show up near the end of the film. And I'm going to knock the film because I think it is imperative of any director to understand how their visual effects are going to look when they decide to use them. Alfredson, looking at those cats, should have said, you know what, let me rewrite this scene because those look absolutely ridiculous. But he didn't, and because of that, this film falls from an A-tier film to a B-tier film. The next film on the list is another all-time classic horror film from another all-time classic director, and that is The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. And I have no problem telling you that if Halloween didn't exist, The Shining would be my favorite horror film of all time. The atmosphere is suffocating, the production design is both eerie and iconic, and this film contains classic moment after classic moment. Just casually mentioning creepy twins, bloody elevators, and here's Johnny to a random stranger will likely lead you into a long conversation about this film. I also love how the construction of this film, especially in terms of the geography of the hotel and the space that characters occupy from shot to shot, can change in subtle but supernatural ways. Have you ever noticed that when the family arrives at the hotel, they almost get hit by a car, but the film jumps forward in time and so you actually end up avoiding them getting hit? That's on purpose, and it's subtly meant to raise your anxiety. It's incredible. I think this is another film where you can see exactly where I'm going. Shining is an all-time great, a vastly influential film, and because of that, I am putting it in the S tier. Next up is Rosemary's Baby, and this is a film that I was not planning on watching because I am not the biggest fan of the director. But when Jordan Peele says jump, I say, yes sir, how high? We all know the director is talented, and the direction of this film was quite good, especially when it came to the performances of Mia Farrow and John Cassavetes, and the slow unraveling of Rosemary's psyche. I wasn't quite sure where we were going with the narrative, and I credit the direction of the film for keeping me guessing. In terms of content, I was absolutely stunned with what this film showed me, considering it came out in 1968. I'm largely referring to the nudity and the satanic aspects of the film. People are literally chanting Hail Satan in this film. Hail Satan! Hail Satan! That's just not something I expected to see when just 8 years earlier, Alfred Hitchcock was treating us to our very first image of a flushing toilet in a film.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Bob Dylan was right. The times were a-changin'. Wrap that all together and you have a film that should sit squarely in the A tier. Except the director can eat my shit. You don't go into the A tier after you drug and rape a 13-year-old girl. So Mr. Director, here's an F for fuck you. With that out of the way, we can now talk about Halloween, my favorite horror film of all time. For those of you who hunkered down in a bunker during the Cold War and are now just emerging, Halloween follows Laurie Strode and friends as they attempt to survive Halloween night as they are stalked and murdered by another all-time horror icon, William Shatner. Michael Myers. Halloween is one of those films you can point at and everything just works. It's beautiful, it's scary, the performances are great, the music is iconic, and its influence is still being felt today. It's also a great example of how you can structure your screenplay so that your scenes feel like they are part of a cohesive whole, as opposed to individual scenes that just proceed one after the other after the other. I made a video a few months back that discusses this in more detail, so if you're curious, the link is in the description box below. And there's also a link to my Patreon down there. When Halloween was released in 1978, it was an absolute game changer of a film that helped usher in the modern slasher movement of the 1980s and led to the creation of horror franchises like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and so many more. It is an absolutely incredible film, and it is one of my favorite films of all time, and it is 100% deserving of going into the S tier. Those are all of Jordan Peele's favorite horror films ranked. Do you agree with how I ranked them, and what films would you include on your list? Also, is there a particular director that you would like me to rank next? Let me know in the comments below. And I bet Jordan Peele would really love it if you were to like this video. He's cool like that.